Hello and welcome to the Kwiatkowski podcast. This is episode 141, Education's Relationship with Masculinity, with Dr. Brendan Kwiatkowski. Did you know that boys have fallen behind girls in almost every measurable academic category? Boys are 6 times more likely to have ADHD diagnosis, 3 to 5 times more likely to be expelled, 2 to 3 times more likely to commit suicide, and are recently reporting higher levels of loneliness on average. There are a lot of reasons to be concerned. This episode, though, is for everyone. A relevant discussion for all educators as well as parents and just people interested in how masculinity and our perceptions of it shape our world. The obvious elephant in the room here is also that there is a small but vocal school of thought that the category of boy, girl, man, woman, due to their elements, some of which are socially constructed, leading some to not see this as an issue that is critical or worth discussing in these terms. And they definitely don't see it, possibly, as existential, like I do. As choir directors, we famously struggle to get boys to keep singing, or even to start singing. Dr. Kwiatkowski, a researcher specializing in adolescent boys' relationship to their emotions, joins me this week to discuss his findings and the broader science about a crucial educational issue. Age 13 to 15, he's going to talk about this later in the episode, was the most difficult time for boys in feeling pressured to appear masculine. Do you see any parallels to when we oftentimes lose boys from choir? I think that if we think that it's just the voice change that sends them away, we are really misunderstanding what is going on in that age group. So stick around and listen to this episode. It is not from a music perspective, but more of a psychological perspective. But I truly believe that if we are going to continue to attract, recruit, educate, and train young boys to grow up to be tenors and basses in the choral music world, we're going to need to understand them. And that's what this episode is all about. So enjoy. Don't forget, there are some really easy and crucial ways that you can help this show survive. One of them is by scratching my back while I scratch yours. I have arranged with several companies for you to be able to put Choralosophy into their checkout code and get discounts on awesome and really important choral products that make your job easier. Sight Reading Factory, obviously a must. Enter Choralosophy at checkout there. I just welcomed Voce Vista Video back onto the show. Choralosophy.com/voce-vista. The module is right there where you can click through my website, buy that software, and then enter Choralosophy at checkout to get a discount. And you can show all of your students their actual sound waves with overtones and vowel shapes in real time. It's an incredible software. Go check that out. Also at mymusicfolders.com, ryanmain.com, and graphitepublishing.com, you can get a discount there with that Choralosophy checkout code. It's also incredibly important if you want to see this show survive and thrive into the next decade or whatever it is. I love doing this show. I want to keep doing it forever, but I need your help. Go over to patreon.com/Choralosophy and subscribe there. Instead of hearing the show for free all the time, you could pay for it. That's hilarious, right? But people do. And it's a growing number of folks over there who appreciate this content being free and being available and want to help me make this show. So that's a way for as little as $3 a month to go over there and help us out. The producers at Patreon are Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, John Warner, Jonah Clixbull, Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, James Mock, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. Okay, everybody, I am here with Brendan Kwiatkowski, and Brendan, I found, as I find oftentimes fun experts to talk to on a variety of topics, on TikTok. And I came across you, Brendan, with a video that you did. Actually, the very first one of yours that I saw was about the term toxic masculinity. And you had a really interesting perspective on that term as being not super prescriptive of an actual solution. And I thought that level of nuanced thinking was really interesting. And then I just kind of dug a little bit more to find out that your main area of research is dealing with teenage boys and their relationships with their emotions. And for everybody listening to this, I sent the invitation to Brendan to come on the show, and I just thought this was really a fun way to start the conversation. Brendan's response to me was, Are you sure choir teachers would want to hear from me? And of course, I responded, "Oh my goodness, yes. This is the existential crisis in the profession of music education right now is how do we get boys to feel comfortable with themselves enough to actually want to sing in front of people? We can get girls to do it. It is really hard to get boys to do it." And so that's kind of where this conversation is going to start. So, Brendan, welcome.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I really love that angle. That I had a moment, I guess, of blinders on of seeing things from one perspective and being like, oh, what do I have to offer music teachers? But then I realized when you mentioned that boys and relationships with band and music, that totally was actually something that even came up in my own research. Plus, I've come across it in other research as well.
Really interesting. That's good. We'll get there, I'm sure. So, why don't you tell everybody first, kind of who you are, where you come from, and so we can kind of zero in on a little bit of your biographical background.
Sure. I'm from the outskirts of Vancouver, Canada, and I was a high school teacher for 5 years before doing my PhD. In that time, I was a high school teacher. I did my master's in special education and came across the statistic that 81% of students diagnosed with emotional and behavioral disorders are male. And at the high school I was teaching at, I like went on all the designation list and I counted and it was like, oh, that's the exact same percentage of boys in my school diagnosed with behavioral disorders. And so then I went into an investigation as to why is that the case. I ended up developing a year-long social emotional intervention for grade 11 boys that had like a notoriously bad reputation at the school. And then from there's multiple life events being impacted by the suicide death of some students that I've taught. And just, they say all research is me search to a certain extent. And I think on a subconscious level, my research into teenage boys' relationships with their emotions, with the sense of what it's like to be a man, and their relationship with school, that reflects my uncertainty about what, and my difficulties about what it was like to be a teenage boy as well. And the research shows that that is such a pivotal time period for teenage boys in their identity formation, and their social circles are changing. There's all this development, there's puberty, and then you add in social media now, and there's just so much going on. And we can look at who are the guides for boys these days, all these other things. But yeah, led me to my research, and now I'm in this weird space of finishing my PhD and trying to decide what to do with it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Now, I think probably a good place to jump into this conversation first would be that when you talk about your interest in researching boys and young adolescent boys, in at least in my area of education in music, one of the things that we hear a lot right now is we are very kind of steeped in the idea that we should be trying to divorce ourselves as much as possible from the category of boy and girl anyway, and be as gender neutral about everything all the time as we possibly can. And what I'm was thought provoked a little bit by watching some of your videos is you seem to obviously think that there is something to research that is very boy specific. Talk to us a little bit about how you think of that and how you draw the line between, say, differences between boys and girls on average versus the fact that not everybody conforms super easily into one of those categories. How do you think about that?
I think that brings up a huge and important point, is that sometimes I think we can talk too much about gender, in the sense that when you ask people to think about like boys and girls and the differences, people will generally revert to more stereotypical views, where if you just present people as people and don't have the division, the categorization ahead of time, people will actually have a lot more equal and egalitarian perspectives. So people can be primed towards thinking more stereotypically about gender, which is why, like in my interviews for my PhD research, if I'm asking them what it's like to be a male, I only introduce that into the conversation like halfway through the interviews, because I just started what's it like to be human, what's it like to be a teenager, and
Hmm.
then I emphasized, okay, all those things you said to me, do you think being male had anything, did it exacerbate any of those issues for you? So in that sense, I think we can we have this tendency to emphasize too much about gender, about the difference between boys and girls primarily, when there's far more in common amongst all genders.
Yes.
Yet holding the tension that even if we're not talking about biological differences, if we just acknowledge the socialization of boys and girls is often dramatically different, then I think it's really important to still hold the categories. Um, it's important to understand and investigate the categories of what boyhood is like, what girlhood is like, because sociologically, there is huge and major differences in the development between boys and girls.
Hmm.
And of course, where people get into huge debates is how much is biological determinism slash essentialism, like how much is it um, biological essences. And so, an example of this that's very common is that uh, boys learn better through tactile learning, and girls have um, are more likely to like sit quietly and learn that way. So
Hmm.
there's this common perception that boys and girls have like biologically fundamentally different learning styles, when none of the research actually supports that difference. It actually supports that just generally people do better with multiple modes of learning, like kinesthetic
Hmm.
learners, things like that. There's actually no gender difference between boys and girls on which one. But I would say that boys tend to be socialized in a way that, like, there is some research there about testosterone we can kind of get into, but this research on testosterone is really tricky to nail down as conclusive that this causes that. But generally speaking, um, girls are more socialized to follow teachers' instructions and to sit, um, and boys are more like okay and expected to be a bit rambunctious. And so when teachers come across rambunctious behavior, uh, that's more expected by boys. And there's research showing that when girls do lesser misbehaviors in the classroom, teachers actually penalize that uh, more firmly. And they've done some research about teachers' perspectives about why they do that. And they don't really know that they're doing it. But when they are made aware of it, one of the reasons is that, oh, because I don't want to get into a fight with my male students, that like I want them to pay attention to what I'm teaching. So like I give them a bit more leeway
Hmm.
in the classroom. And so there's a lot of research that boys are allotted more linguistic space in the classroom and more physical space in the classroom.
That's
So I
interesting.
think those, yeah, there's a lot to impact sociologically and biologically.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So okay. So I've been teaching for 20 years, and I've probably had somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 male students in my life, and so because again in my world it's skewed, less boys than girls.
What would you say the ratio is?
It's about 2 to 1. So two
Okay.
girls to every boy that oftentimes will take high school choir, and that's actually a really good ratio. So like I actually have more boys than than most of my colleagues do, and what I notice is that there are, here's kind of how I think of it. Yes, there's debates, and I've read into some of them, and I've participated in some of them about the biological causes versus the socialization causes of some of those things. I've always kind of it seemed to me that there's always some combination of both of those things involved in a lot of human stuff. But also at the same time, I don't really care because ultimately, like the kids come into my classroom with the needs that they have, and I would have to have some major blinders on to not notice that my boys need different things than my girls do in almost every case, with the acknowledgement always that those are averages and that there's always exceptions and like to those behavioral needs and emotional needs. I know, for example, my boys need to move around more.
Hmm.
If I want to keep their attention, I need to have them moving around the space a lot more. And in general, my girls don't want to. They're shy, and it's something that I have to coax out of them. So it's interesting to me just to kind of think about like is it, in your mind, a meaningful category in the educational context, regardless of what causes some of those differences? Does that make sense at all as a question?
Yeah, I think that is exactly what I would want to say, is that these gender is important to teach about, and like whether it's trans, non-binary, boys, girls, because people of those different categorizations have unique experiences, or
Mm-hmm.
they have experiences that are greatly impacted by their gender. And so to acknowledge that is really important. And it can get restrictive when people say, like, all boys are that way and they have to be that way. Like, that's what I would want to stay away from. But I think it's really important to address the categories. And I know in Canada, there's only one university that has a teacher program that teaches about gender and education, in their actual teaching preparedness program. And I was fortunate enough to teach that for one semester during my PhD. And so, yeah, I think that, and if you want to look at I also like a psychological lens as well, is that we can have students have transference with different teachers. Like, our, as an educator, assuming that you're a male educator, and you can interact with different students differently, and they will have different experiences of you based on your maleness. And that is something that, yeah, it's like, to not acknowledge that or pretend like that doesn't matter would be missing out on like how humans interact and engage.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I'm sure you've heard about this, especially with your area of research, but I think the author's name is Isaac Reeves, who wrote a book about boys falling behind in education recently. Does that sound familiar to you at all?
Um, I don't. I know that that has been written about huge. I would say there's. I'm not familiar with his name off the top of my head, but I know, like, Dr. Warren Farrell is also
Okay.
huge, talking
I
about
think
boys
I heard
falling.
him reference. I actually heard some podcasts that he did when that book came out, and I heard him reference that name as well. But the big kind of topic that I want to get your take on with this is that with the kind of what I would call a crisis of young men and boys in our culture and our society, especially in education, falling behind girls, in many ways falling behind girls more than girls were behind boys. 100 years ago, when girls were told they didn't even have to get educations because they would just marry somebody, and that kind of thing. That to me is kind of alarming, and I wonder how, if we don't kind of treat young boys, like a meaningful category, how do we help them? That's where kind of my tension in education is, and I wonder what your ideas or thoughts about that is.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. Like, for instance, um, there's always a part of me that when we talk about the boy crisis and education specifically, uh, that generally speaking, like, no group is a monolith. Like, boys tend to
Yep.
be some of the highest achieving, but they have a lot average on the low end. If you look at Canada, if you compare graduation rates between boys and girls, girls are like 3% more likely to graduate. Um, but then if you look at Aboriginal Canadians, then it's like a difference of 8% or 10%. So it's much larger than the gender gap, is like the
Mhm.
racial gap. So those are other important factors to consider in there. Um, so when we talk about the boy crisis in education, it's where I'm always curious, where do people point the finger as to what is responsible for it? So there's one large body that says schools are over feminized, with just, it's elementary school especially, so many female teachers. Um, and then there's some other people that would point more to, like, um, boys and their peer groups, especially, and what is considered like popular masculinity, shies boys away from pursuing certain academic subjects or subjects deemed too feminine. Often the humanities, band, music sometimes can be associated in that as well. I know
Hmm.
languages, French can as well. And then there's another perspective that's like, is this actually a problem? Because yes, the amount of female students that graduate and go to university is like quite a bit higher than boys. And boys have higher dropout rates in university as well. Um, but then if you follow women after they graduate, and this has to do with often having starting families or getting married, like their careers, they feel more of a time pressure to do things quickly before they have kids or things like
Mm-hmm.
that. Whereas
Yeah.
men can sometimes go a bit later in, or there's some career opportunities like in the trades that is dominated by boys and men that don't necessarily need a graduate diploma. So like those are kind of a lot of the different nuances within that discussion. But I think that there's for sure, and like when you look at like in the States, boys are 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, depending on the state, like 3 to 5 times more likely to be suspended, expelled. There is something that is worthy of attention.
Mm-hmm.
The 2 to 3 times more likely to die from suicide. Um, the lack of connection that starts, like lack of close connections, intimate close connections that starts in their teenage years, and then we're looking at like a epidemic or pandemic, whatever, of men that are more lonely than they've ever been in their lives. I think there's a lot of reasons to be concerned. Um, and to just, yeah, that's obviously why I'm doing this
Yeah.
research. But maybe I forgot your initial question.
No, it's okay. You actually answered it really well. That was definitely the type of thinking that I was going for there to try to hear your thoughts on that. And it's tangential to what was my next thought was going to be anyway, which is it your experience? Because it seems to be mine, and I just want to bounce this idea off you and see what you think. That young adolescent boys, especially right after puberty, and in those first few years after puberty, in my experience seem to identify and take a bigger chunk of their personal identity out of the idea of being seen as manly and seeing as a man, as girls do, being like with words like woman or womanly. They seem to be more okay with girl, whereas young boys, they want to be seen as a man, like real fast. Is that out to left field, or does that seem like a
That
reasonable
checks out with
observation?
my research. And
Okay.
yeah, sorry for interrupting
Oh,
you.
you're
Yeah,
good.
that definitely checks out with my and other research. I interviewed boys 17 to 19 years old, most in grade 12, and they all said, without any discrepancies, that like the age from 13 to 15 was the most difficult in terms of when they felt the most pressure to be masculine. I'm not sure if you know any boys that like force their voices to be lower than
Mm-hmm.
before they hit puberty.
Yep.
But that, yeah, something I come across quite a bit. And so they found that those years, because there's like, one, it's puberty, there your body's changing, there's all this insecurity, you're going often transitioning to a larger school. Developmentally, it's the first time in children's lives where they become more concerned or they look for approval more from their friends than they do from from their parents. And so there's all of these changing factors that happens in adolescence, and there's more social figuring out in those early high school years, according to the boys in the research. And then by the end, they felt like there was some relaxing, that there was a bit more acceptance, like grade 11, grade 12, of boys that kind of being themselves. And this is when I hear the boys like regretting not taking music classes, not trying things that they felt like, oh, it wasn't cool enough. Um, and they didn't have the confidence to do it earlier on in their schooling years.
Yeah. No, that is exactly what I see. In fact, it's anecdotal because I'm not a scientist. That's what you do, but I'm just a teacher. And so, anecdotally, one of the experiences that I had recently, about 4 years ago, was that for many decades at my school, we had a class called men's choir.
Mm.
It was called men's choir, and it was when I was in that class. I went to this school. I grew up in this town. There were 100 boys and men in that choir, grades 9 through 12. Then, of course, our town changed and more schools grew in, and so the numbers kind of shrank down. But about 5 or 6 years ago in that class, I had anywhere between, depending on the year, 50, 60, 70 boys. in that one beginning. It was beginning ninth grade choir. Then, in an effort to be inclusive, our school district required that we changed the name from men's choir to tenor and bass choir.
Mm.
And since that time, our numbers have fallen by more than half. And one of the things, and of course, those are nothing is single variable that would cause that to happen. But one of the things that I noticed, and it's the reason I asked the question about do boys identify with those terms more, is because I feel like in my all girls classes, or mostly girls, because we have some non binary kids in there as well, that changed to a more gender neutral, almost what I saw as a net positive. But for the boys, it was a culture killer because it like when you're coming out of eighth grade and you're looking to choose a class to take in high school because of that need to be seen as masculine. I think that men's choir on their course sheet was my biggest recruiting tool, and they took it from me, and named it something neutral. Which for the boys in that age group, like they could see like, yeah, I could be in a men's choir. I don't know about, I don't know what a tenor bass is, but like I could be in a men's choir. That'd be cool. And we lost that, and I really think it had an effect on their choices of courses.
I think that's entirely plausible. Yeah,
Yeah.
that I could definitely see that as being something that would get a certain demographic of boys more likely to do it. And so then, yeah, then you have to weigh. I've also been in experiences where things have been divided by gender, and then some students could feel isolated or not seen, or not that's not true of their identity, and then they don't feel like they belong.
Yeah.
So it's this tension about like it reminds me of my research and other research that the boys that were the most emotionally expressive were more often than not quite athletic and like almost more the jocks in the school. The jock has such a negative connotation to it, but they were definitely like more elite athletes at the school. And two reasons. One is that they felt that the sports themselves, excelling at something, gave them confidence to be who they are, but also they had less negativity. If they were to challenge their gender norms around emotions, they were still really respected as being manly enough in other sectors. And so and a lot of schools, at least where I am, they pit sports against music, where like it's hard to fit band in with some of the sports timetablings and scheduling there. So often students have to choose. But there's this acknowledgement that appealing to some established norms of masculinity, and I'm not saying in a harmful way, but that some sense of being a man, which most boys connect with that idea, at least, of like wanting to be a man in a positive way, that will have an effect on enticing boys to join the program.
Yeah,
I could
no, I
definitely
totally
see that.
agree. Yeah, that actually brings up the I mentioned right as we signed on your thoughts about toxic masculinity versus other types of masculinity, because you mentioned like certain aspects of masculinity that are not necessarily harmful, but they're common and they're in people's minds and in people's socialization. So would you share a little bit about with my audience that maybe hasn't seen your TikTok yet, because I will put it in the show notes, but that your thoughts about why that term isn't super helpful, especially when we're talking about the sports bros and all those things, that culture in our school.
Yeah, I would say that toxic masculinity I don't find helpful because it's not nuanced to actually describe what's going on, and because it's not nuanced enough, or it's used too broadly, then it loses its power as to what is the actual harmful aspects of harmful forms of masculinity, and then what could the positive ones be. And so like the research shows that there's like three main beliefs that if you hold these beliefs rigidly, this leads to the most negative outcomes for boys and men themselves and for other people in terms of like sexism, violence, things like that. And that's to be self-reliant, like don't ask help from people, do everything yourself, um, limit your emotions, restrict your emotions. And the third one is the desire or the need to be dominant. And that one I don't defend. Like that needing to be dominant is very different than being an assertive leader. Like those are qualities, but like the actual desire to be dominant or to need to dominate others, I don't think that's very redemptive in my own view. But the other ones about being self-reliant, and being emotionally restricted is I recently presented at a high school for graded boys, and I kind of like tricked them. I asked them, is it ever good to be those things? And they all thought the answer I wanted to hear was like, oh, it's never good to be those things. It's like, oh, like I think educators want students to be self-reliant, at least in their classroom and learning and things like that. So there's good qualities about being self-reliant. There's good qualities about restricting your emotions in certain settings, but it becomes harmful when those are rigid and you're then unable to express your emotions in contexts where it's safe to do so.
Yeah.
Or you're able to ask for help when it's safe to do so. And I'll even I'll give an example from my research is that there was this boy who was bullied for like 5 years in middle school, early high school, and he got into like probably 5 fights a year. No friends during that time period, but he said that his ability to fight back, which some people might label as toxic masculinity, trying to solve their problems with violence. He didn't initiate it, but he always defended himself. He said that that gave him, at least he held on to his own self-power during those 5 years. That like, yeah, he's like, I don't fight anymore now, or like that's not great, but I still feel like that was in my context and in my situation, which was more survival based, that was really beneficial.
Mm.
And so I think toxic masculinity needs context, and restrictive masculinity, I think, gives more context, and it shows why things can be harmful because they restrict who you are and who other people can be. And now, actually, since that TikTok, I've been introduced to what I think is the flip term of what is the positive masculinity we should be going for. And I think that the positive masculinity we should go for is a connected masculinity. So we're connected to ourselves and we're connected to others. And if we look at other people, like we help other people, like a good leader, a good person also empowers other people to be themselves and to be connected as well. So that's kind of my thoughts on the terminology around toxic masculinity.
Right.
The main opposition I have is when, like, there was a lot of people that said like, but there are some things that are higher rates associated with masculinity. Like, let's talk about like rape culture or rape perpetration, things like that, which is like that. If you don't call that toxic, then that is too gentle of a term. And so I guess I view restrictive masculinity as like an upstream, like this is like kind of more of the root cause that unchecked and rigidly adhered to, when people are shut down off of their emotions, when they think they need to be dominant, then that can definitely lead to toxic behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of where I was going to go too, is like that's like rape perpetration would be a good example of what I think it would be fair to call a toxically masculine behavior, in the sense that it's mostly men that do it, and it is toxic. But then again, you're being more specific, which is where those types of terms are always better if you're being specific. I think we tend to use, culturally, we use those terms as these wide sweeping, very, very broad, I don't even know what you're talking about types of, I hear people use, I would say people use terms like toxic masculinity. They use terms like white supremacy. They use terms like misogyny, all in a very similar way. And that where we, like, what exactly is being talked about here, I'm not really sure. And so I agree with you in the sense that it's better if we take the terms and we boil them down rather than the buzzwords or the lingo that we're using, and think about the actual behavior itself, and in what way is it useful, what way is it harmful, what way is it adaptive, or maybe even, like you said, connected. And just to play devil's advocate, I would say that if your idea about connected masculinity, when you were describing that, Maybe somebody who doesn't see, maybe somebody who's a little bit more of a modern gender theorist would be thinking about, well, but everyone should be connected in those ways. So how does connected masculinity serve as a useful term when really everybody should be behaving that way? How would you respond to
Well,
that?
there's a big debate even in the field of masculinities of the whether we should be striving for positive masculinity or just positive humanity, like
Mm-hmm.
positive humanness.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and that's an interesting debate. Like some people are afraid that if we talk about positive masculinity, then that will just end up being more rigid and restrictive as well, being like, okay, generally people think of positive masculinity as like responsible, integrity, a man of leadership, integrity, all responsible, all these things. But it's like, does that mean then women aren't able to be those things? And I definitely don't think that. So I guess I lean a bit on that debate as I think that masculinity or being a male, just like femininity, and has meaning for people. For some people,
Mm-hmm.
I think the like for non-binary people, it is liberating to not be in those boxes. But for some people, being connected to like this is my masculinity. Like if we go back to Carl Jung, like the Jungian concept is of like femininity and masculinity is like the anima and animus, which is like the belief that all humans have both the feminine and masculine divine or energy inside themselves. And I know for a lot of people that are extremely feminist, I know some of them that shy away from any of that Jungian stuff, and some that just personally find it really empowering to like visualize themselves as having both types of energies inside themselves. Whereas some people, like, I think the goal is just to not be restrictive in the way that you, yeah, go about thinking about these things. About like, do you think that if women are more nurturing, does that mean that boys and men can't be nurturing, or how do you define that? And I think that often is where people's stereotypical ideas actually falls apart if you actually challenge it on the day-to-day level.
Right.
But going back to what you said about terminology as well, like you mentioned like white supremacy, all these things, is that about having precise definitions? If I'm allowed, can I swear on your podcast for a
Uh-huh.
moment?
Yep.
Okay, one of my favorite titled articles I've ever come across, academic articles, is called Fuck Nuance. And I'm someone who loves nuance. And I think nuance is super important with terminology and things like that. But the argument from this article called Fuck Nuance was saying sometimes you can get so into the minutia that you cease to see what the actual issue is here. And so I would I would not like if someone took even restrictive masculinity and really liked that and was like, okay, it's all about the individual level, like this person's relationship with emotions, blah, 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 without still holding on to the acknowledgement that on a grand scale, like men commit 90% of all crimes, of violent crimes and things like that. Like there's sometimes where you need to see the forest, and there's other times where you also need to focus on the trees, and like people's individual psychological experiences are those trees. And so I think this argument on social media around terms like, and even like the term like wokeness has been like weaponized and used, and like I would say it's been intentionally taken from what was originally a black term to now being like no one quite knows what it means, but everyone has ideas of what it means. And so it's a way that language is used, and language is weaponized, and one of the weaponizations is making it meaningless
Yep.
by what it initially intended to do. And
Thank
so it's
you,
kind of
Mr.
like,
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Derrida.
I don't,
That's yeah. That's deconstruction. That was
mm,
the purpose of Derrida. Yeah, it's a horrible book. Don't ever read it. But it's the idea that if I can make the word mean, not only I can make it word mean A, but I can also make it mean B, and A
mhm.
and B are opposites, then I have nullified the word. I've made it meaningless, and you can see that with a lot of words. and that's not really the topic of this podcast, but it's an interesting thing that I think you just hit the nail on the head. A lot of these terms, you're right, when they're social media terms, we've got one side that uses one definition, one side that uses essentially the opposite definition, and they're arguing with each other, and that means no one knows what the other one's talking about.
And academics are some of the worst people for this.
Yeah.
Like, you go to a conference and they just either they define their terms for 10 minutes before talking, which is actually probably helpful, or they spend the whole time talking, but they're not really arguing about the same thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so there's this tension of like, I want to use a term that actually helps humanize boys and helps humanize men and allows men to also help understand what's going on with them. If my term doesn't do that, then I don't want people. Well, that's not
What do
my
you think
term per
about
se.
what do you think about the term liberated masculinity? And the way I would maybe, this just came to me, I had not thought about this before. I was just thinking about this just now, meaning that it's okay for me to identify with being masculine and being a man and being having masculine traits, but it's also okay that my conception of that is different than yours, and I'm not going to get my definition of what it means to be a man from you. We each have our own way of interacting as men in the world, and that part of my masculine confidence, you might say, comes from the fact that I have my own, and I don't need your approval for what that means. Thoughts?
I love how you explained it. So yeah, in
Mhm.
that sense, it's like I'm not sure how much the term matters
Right.
versus just how people make meaning of the term, which
Yeah.
reminds me of my Reformation class in high school about like Erasmus and Martin Luther talking, and Erasmus said, "You're not going to just create two churches; you're going to create thousands of churches if you break off from the Catholic tradition."
Yeah.
And then sure enough, that's what happened. And the thing is, there is so many ways to be a man.
Yeah.
Like, there's not just one prescriptive notion. As much as we want to cling on to those ideals, and I think studying history is really significant. I always use the example of cowboys because we think of cowboys as really rugged masculinity, kind of appealing, like the Lone Ranger type thing. But at the time that cowboys were a thing, is that they were not respected as men in societies, which is why they were called cowboys, because they were known for their aggressiveness, their impulsiveness, their gambling, and they weren't the traits of what a respectable, mature man would be at the time.
Hmm.
So it's just interesting how definitions change even in a relatively short period of time. But
Yeah.
we often think that, oh, the way men have been is always the way men have been,
Right.
or the way that people want men to be, like the strong, tough, not wearing feminine clothing, things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting, and I think um, as educators, we think about the how some of these ideas are, easy for you and I as adult men to talk about because we've been through some of these changing periods in our life. We've already been through puberty. We've, in many cases, I saw on social media that you're a dad, I'm a dad. You start to have a developed sense of your own identity as independent from other men and boys. But when you're in puberty and in those years immediately after, I don't think that we've yet figured out who we are. This is true of girls too, but in that you just kind of unique space of the expectations that are put on boys at that age, I think that maybe kind of in the last few minutes of our talk here, if you could just kind of think about some of the highlights of things that came up and insights that came up in your research when you were talking to all these boys, just about some of the more interesting things or conversations that you had, or maybe even things that you didn't realize about being a boy until you went back and researched it later.
First thing that comes to mind is how lonely generally the boys were and how desirous of connection they were. Have some boys I talked to said, like, I just want a hug, not like a romantic hug. I just want like a
Hmm.
person to care and to hug me. Boys who, and I feel like people might have the wrong impression, like, oh, I'm just talking to loner boys or boys who are isolated. It's like, no, I'm talking about boys that have a lot of social groups and friends that are just still lonely. And I I compared the least emotionally restricted and the most emotionally restricted teenage boys. And even those that were emotionally restricted had this desire to connect more to their male friends. And the highly emotionally expressive boys, generally speaking, had what I called emotional safe havens, primarily with girls in their lives, with female peers.
Yep.
But those boys still desired and really wanted their male friends to be part of it as well. But they also still felt stuck about like, some of them felt like, I'm not sure if my male friends are ready for that or will actually do that. But when I'm reading everyone and talking to everyone, it's like they all want connection. There's not one teenage boy that does not want connection. And the most humbling thing for me is that I kind of expected that when I talked to the most emotionally restricted boys, I thought, one, some of them would say, oh, I've always been this way. This is just the way I naturally am. And that was not the case. All of them remembered what time period, or a specific reason of why they started to restrict their emotions. And I also expected that they would kind of just be a bit more emotionally unintelligent, if I'm completely honest. But that was not my experience at all. From talking with these boys who are highly emotionally restricted, there's a good argument to be made that they were almost more aware of their emotions because they were so concerned and so aware of other people's emotions and their own emotions of not expressing it. So yes, they did have their shut down emotions, but it's not like they didn't care about their emotions. They thought about their relationship with emotions a lot, even if they didn't necessarily express their emotions.
And so we don't see
this,
that.
yeah, don't see it.
We don't see it. Yeah.
And this blew me out of the water. Like, I know that there might have been some priming because we were talking about emotions in our conversation at some point in our interview. But at the end, I asked them, we talked about school a lot in my research, about their experiences of school. I didn't even actually put it in my PhD because I ran out of space. But then I asked them, if you could change one thing about school, what would it be? 95% of them said having actually adequate emotional education. One of my favorite quotes is, I know nothing about emotions. Even girls, I hardly know anything about girls, but I know like nothing about emotions. And so they all want better or more emotional education. And the things that currently are out there, they just said, if they got it, they felt, one, either shamed that they need to be more emotional, and like, why are you not sharing your emotions? You need to share their emotions, which I would say doesn't actually reflect their experiences. Because if you understand why boys don't share their emotions, you're going to have a lot more compassion and understanding of why they don't. So there's different ways to encourage boys to open up, but you have to be gentle about it, not like shaming them for not opening up. And
they're skeptical.
Like, just,
I was going to sorry to interrupt. I'm just going to say they're skeptical oftentimes that they're safe to do it. And that's partly why it's tricky.
Yeah, they question about whether people actually genuinely want to hear their negative emotions.
Yep.
And whether they'll regret it afterwards. And research shows this. The only thing worse than not sharing your emotions is sharing your emotions with someone who responds terribly.
Yep.
Like, it makes more sense to hide your emotions if the person that you're going to share with responds terribly. And that's why I encourage adults, educators, students as well, when I'm talking to them, is that if you do not even have a safe person to share your emotions with, can you be your own emotional safe haven? Can you feel it within inside yourself? Can you notice your emotions going on, and can you process those maybe quietly in your room, or not quietly, just privately in your room? Yeah, and that's tough work. I know that often an approach, like, people care, education systems are caring more about social emotional education, I would say. But from boys' perspectives, having someone do an assembly to come in and motivate people about emotions is not effective.
Yes. In fact, earlier on, you talked about the debate between the guys and the boys, young boys and men falling behind due to a feminization of the school system versus other types of causes. These are the types of things that kind of give me the thought that there's some credence to a feminized school. And as I said before, I don't really believe in any like single thing causing all the things. Like it's always a combination of things. But oftentimes in schools, if we try to get boys to, open up or feel their emotions, we do it in ways that works for the girls. And very rarely do we alter that approach specifically for the boys. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that too, partly because we're thinking about, well, they're all just the same anyway, which we talked about before. And the other part of it is that there is, I think, a little bit of, within education, there's a little bit of hostility towards masculinity, if I'm being honest. I think sometimes there is and I think this goes back to what we were talking about before, boys tend to be rowdier, boys tend to get in trouble more, and I don't think it's conscious, but I think sometimes what happens is in the back of our subconscious, we think, well, if we can get the boys to be more like the girls, then the school will run just like a whole lot better anyway. And I think some of these things come out subliminally. Thoughts?
Yeah, I would say that there has not been a good link in the research that schools are over feminized to the detriment of boys. Like in my own research, I was specifically looking, are you more connected to your male teachers over your female teachers? And all the research, including my own, says that from students' own perspectives, the gender of their teacher doesn't matter. And
now, that's not what I meant by feminizing. So just to be clear, that's not what I meant by I meant going through processes and social emotional learning activities and, like you said, assemblies and all the different types of things in ways that might be more conducive to girls' needs of dealing with those processes or dealing with those problems. And that those same activities might work for girls but don't work for boys. And then there doesn't seem to be that follow-up activity for, okay, now, so what do we do? That didn't really work very well for the boys. So what do we do for them? I never hear that question.
Gotcha. I think there's a lot of merit. I would frame it that schools are more geared towards compliance, and girls tend to be more compliant. And so that I totally... I think is the case.
I've got you thinking.
No, you have. Like, I think that I understand your question and what you're saying now. And I think the more unexplored people's ideas of gender are and teachers' perspectives of gender are, the more likely systems and schools and teachers are to perpetuate more gender stereotypical things. And so I think you're absolutely right in that a lot of these things are subliminal, which is why I think we need to have teacher education that is about gender, to acknowledge, it's like, oh, I actually do treat the boys in my class slightly differently than the girls in my class, and not saying, just notice that, not saying it's good or bad, but depends on how is that actually impacting different things. Are you giving your male students more physical freedom in the class? And if so, maybe that's great for all of your students to actually do. And maybe you need to encourage some of your female students to actually break out of their boxes a bit more. So yeah, I think that raises a good point in the way that systems are. I still view it as compliance centered.
That makes total sense to me.
Generally speaking, teachers, what's the easiest class to manage is when students aren't bringing up when you have a class of your band teacher, 60 kids.
I'm a choir, but yeah, I've got my biggest class is 95, and it's boys and girls, about half and half. And then, like I said, I have the all boys, the tenor bass choir used to be called men's choir, and then I also have girls' voices also, and they're all separated out by class until they become older.
I know a couple schools around me that brings up a good point back to your men's choir group, is that there's some PE classes in grade 12, some choice PE classes, gym classes, that are for women only. And the girls that take those classes just love the space free from boys, essentially.
Yeah.
And so, but the school districts are figuring out, like, what do we do with that as well? Because is there spaces that girls and or boys can exist that is beneficial to them, but also not ostracizing people as well? And so, yeah, I think that the conversation around gender is an important one, but it does, for teachers on their practicalities, I think teachers are dealing with a lot of these practicalities on the front lines.
Yeah.
Of
And seeing
how do I actually get students to learn and to actually experience a relationship that's healthy and grow into human beings.
Yeah, and on the front lines. Teachers see these contradictions in the same way that you just brought up. Like, how do we get the space for the girls to be together and thrive in a way that seems to be beneficial to them, but at the same time not exclude somebody? That's a contradiction. The real world is messy, and we have these are things that we have to grapple with, and I think you and I have done that pretty well tonight. We're grappling. We're not answering and solving the world's problems here on the show, but we are grappling with them. So as we kind of wrap this up, I've mentioned your TikTok a couple times, but are there any other things that people could do if they want to kind of get more of your thoughts on this topic, or are you publishing this research at any point? Tell us where we can catch up with you as we go forward.
Everything's available on my website, www.remasculine.com. And I'm actually going to start, I'll test it out. I'm going to make a resource for teachers and parents about talking to your students or your kids about Andrew Tate, because all the kids I talk to, like at that assembly I was just at for grade 8 boys, they just wanted to talk about Andrew Tate. Grade 12 boys just want to talk about Andrew Tate. And I think it's a really important conversation that high school boys are super engaged with. And so I'm hoping to grow some of my resources actually on my website as well.
So remasculine, why did you choose the re prefix before masculine?
Yeah, it's kind of more a play on like emails, like regarding masculinity. So it's like content regarding masculinity.
Not restoring masculine, but like regarding masculine, or both.
It can be both. It's complicated being both because of this tension that we've talked about, and holding the contradictions and being like, let's not pretend that things are smoother than they are, because things are messy sometimes. So if I say restoring masculinity, it's like, what era am I restoring it to? It's like, and it's like different definitions, or has this masculinity, there's a lot of implications that something's gone wrong with masculinity and it needs to be back to where it is. And then it's like, are we talking biblical times here? Are we?
And then you're Andrew Tate.
It could go that way. Well, I won't go that way, but
that's good. That's good. Me neither. I think that's really interesting that you're providing a resource for talking to kids about that. I might check that out. Is it not up yet, or you're still working on it, or what is that?
Yeah, I have the draft of it. I haven't put it on the website yet, so within the month of March.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, cool. I'll check that out, and I really appreciate your time, and I think people are going to find this really useful. Oftentimes, I'll do shows like this where we didn't talk about music much, but we do talk about things that are relevant to the things that we do as teachers in music, but also just, I would say, education in general. So that I think that there's going to be a lot of people that find this helpful, and I appreciate your expertise and insight.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thank you, as always, for sticking around to the end of an episode. I hope you found that informative and entertaining enough to have still been here after this point in time, or maybe you just thought it was really dumb and you are hate listening at this point at the end of the episode. Either way, I'm glad you're listening. I'm glad you are here. Don't forget to head over to the Chorelosophers Facebook page to join there for conversation about this episode as well as others. You will see in that group that I post every episode there, allowing people, if they want, to join into a conversation about what they heard there or just in general about that topic. Then, of course, you can go to patreon.com/Choreosophy and sign up to be a supporter of the show for as little as a coffee. Well, less than a coffee now with inflation per month. and that helps me a lot. We're getting close to 160 members over there, which is really, really exciting. And then, of course, enter the Korolosophy checkout code at ryanmain.com, graphitepublishing.com, sitereadingfactory.com, mymusicfolders.com, and now Voce Vista. Korolosophy.com/voce-vista. The link is in the show notes, and you can go there as well to enter that Korolosophy checkout code. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.